In December 2020, Paul Ramsey, owner of Bamouth Estate in Perthshire, did something his neighbors considered agricultural suicide. He removed 300 sheep from 12 fields and signed the paperwork to demolish 5 kilometers of internal fencing. Then he released pigs, ponies, and cattle onto the land, without grazing plans, without rotation. What happened next, science has yet to fully explain. Within 4 years, self-seeded regeneration of oak, rowan, and hazel appeared on what had been monoculture pastures without a single planting. The diversity of pollinating insects across the estate's plots substantially exceeds the figures from neighboring farms with comparable terrain, and researchers monitoring the small rivers of the Tay catchment recorded an anomaly. Water downstream of Banff behaves differently during floods than anywhere else in the district. This is the story of 5 species that knew nothing of one another, and together accomplished something no restoration program would have planned quite this way. It is about why the skeptics were partly right, and it is about an outcome that turned out to be not a victory, but something more complicated and more interesting. Banff Estate is not simply a farm, it is a manor dating to 1232. The Ramsey family has held it for 8 centuries, and throughout that time the land has changed, but not toward recovery. The Scottish Highlands are one of the most degraded landscapes in Europe. This is not the opinion of environmental activists. It is the consensus of decades of ecological research, from Scottish universities to international conservation organizations. What today looks like wilderness, whether heather moorland, bare hillsides, or treeless pasture, is the result of millennia of sheep and deer grazing and the systematic destruction of forests. 3 species disappeared from here before anything else did, and their disappearance changed everything. The Eurasian beaver vanished from Scotland around the 16th century. With it went the dams, hundreds of small natural structures on streams and tributaries that slowed water, spread it sideways, and forced it to seep into the ground. When the dams disappeared, water ran straight down the hillside, fast, carrying soil with it. The wild boar disappeared from Scotland in the 13th century. It rooted. It turned over the topsoil, broke up the turf, and exposed the mineral horizon. This looks like destruction, but in reality it is seedbed preparation. A seed fallen from a tree canopy cannot germinate through a dense mat of grass, but it can through ground broken open by a boar. The wild horse disappeared earlier still. It grazed coarsely and unevenly, not like a sheep which clips grass to the root in an even front. And it created a mosaic, patches of varying vegetation height where birds could nest, insects shelter, and wildflowers grow. Without those 3, Scotland is not wilderness. It is a lawn without a caretaker, gradually becoming a monoculture. The American parallel is more precise than it appears. On the Great Plains, before the destruction of the bison, 70 million animals annually plowed the prairie with their hooves, turning old grass into dung and opening the soil to seed. After their disappearance, the prairie began to simplify, not immediately, but relentlessly. Sheep and cattle eat differently. They do not restore what the bison built over millennia. This is not merely theory. In 1994, researchers at the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas reintroduced bison to a stretch of grassland where they had been absent for over a century. 2 control plots were left alongside, one without any grazers and one with domestic cattle. 29 years later, bison had increased plant species diversity by 103% compared to the ungrazed plots. Cattle produced less than half that result. A study published in PNAS in 2022 recorded a further detail. The diversity gains withstood the most severe drought in 4 decades and did not diminish. In other words, the effect proved not a temporary spike, but a structural change. The land remembered what a bison was. It simply needed one to return. But there is a reverse side. On one of the plots where bison were held at high density on a limited area, the population of the bobolink, a ground-nesting grassland bird, declined by 62% over 18 years. The same animal, different density, produced the opposite result. Banff Estate in 2020 looked exactly like this. Productive from a sheep farming standpoint, but biologically empty. 20 plant species where there could have been 200. Minimal pollinating insects. No natural forest regeneration. But by the time Ramsey removed the sheep, restoration had already been underway at Bamouth for 30 years, in 3 separate waves. The first, the 1990s, people with shovels and seedlings. Paul Ramsey began restoring woodland cover on the estate's hills, organic farming, manual expansion of riparian margins, new hedgerows, slow, hands-on work without guarantees. The second, 2002. Beavers. Not through a government program, no official reintroduction existed at the time. Several animals escaped from a private enclosure at Oak Herrick in Perthshire and settled in the Tay catchment. Ramsey did not drive them out. Over the following 18 years, they built more than 50 dams on Bamouth, without a plan, without a budget, without human assistance. Together, these structures transformed former drainage ditches into a branching system of wetlands covering roughly a third of the estate. The third wave, December 2020. The sheep gone, the land empty, and Ramsey decides to do something his neighbors considered nonsensical. The idea is called rewilding, and in Scotland it has been the subject of genuine conflict for more than a decade. Ramsey's version was more radical than most. Don't plant trees, don't build ponds, don't devise a restoration plan. Simply stop what is preventing the system from recovering on its own, excessive grazing. Then add the animals that performed their ecological roles for millennia before human management. In 2022, 4 Tamworth pigs arrived at Banff. These are not ornamental animals. The Tamworth is the closest domestic analog to wild boar in behavior and morphology. They root. They range over large distances. They do not stay in one place. In 2024, 11 Exmoor ponies followed, a breed considered the closest living relative of the prehistoric horse of the British Isles, plus 20 head of local cattle breeds, plus roe deer already living on the land. And the key step, drawn out over time, was that 5 kilometers of internal fencing were gradually removed. Not in a day, not in a year, but eventually the animals gained access to everything: woodland, pasture, bog, stream banks. Without rotational grazing, without target zones, without control over where each species feeds. Criticism arrived immediately, and it was specific. Neighboring farmers identified a real risk. Unmanaged grazing on the fragile soils of the Scottish Highlands can accelerate erosion rather than arrest it. Pigs root, but if rooting is too intensive on a single patch, you do not get a prepared seedbed, you get an open wound in the peat that takes years to close. Some ornithologists cautioned that several ground-nesting species, lapwing and curlew among them, depend on precisely the even pasture that enclosure eliminates. Full scrub recovery could displace them. These were not weak arguments. They had substance, and science supports some of these concerns. Research into pig behavior shows they concentrate activity near water sources, streams, bogs, wet ground. These are exactly the most vulnerable soils. The pits and depressions created by rooting slow surface runoff and raise soil moisture, but on steep slopes, the same mechanism can destabilize the topsoil and accelerate its removal. The difference between prepared seedbed and open wound in the peat comes down to one thing, where the pig decides to dig, and that is the pig's decision, not a human one. 2021. The fields were empty, apart from the roe deer already living here. The land lies fallow for a full year. This too is a decision. Let the system rest before introducing new actors. March 2022. The first 4. Tamworth pigs arrive at Banff. The first thing they did was not what anyone expected. Rather than spreading evenly across the fields, they stopped on one patch at the boundary between open pasture and old oak woodland, and began rooting there. Over the first season, they turned over roughly 2 hectares of soil along this transition zone. The following spring, self-seeded regeneration of oak, rowan, and hazel appeared across those 2 hectares. No planting, no ecologist had put anything in the ground. The seeds had been lying in the soil for years, unable to germinate through the turf. The pigs opened the ground. The seeds came up. This was not a surprise in theory. The role of wild boar as an ecosystem engineer is well established in the scientific literature. But to see it happen in a single season, without any additional intervention, was another thing. Meanwhile, the local cattle breeds were doing their work, but the pigs had done something else that had not been anticipated. At Knepp, England's largest rewilding project, where Tamworths have been working since 2009, the pigs rooting opened soil for solitary bees, and the upturned clods triggered the formation of anthills that attracted green woodpeckers. Nobody planned this. It was discovered after the fact. At Bamouth, comparable monitoring is only beginning. and researchers are deliberately not rushing toward conclusions. Complex systems do not reveal themselves in a single season. A sheep selects. It finds tender grass and clips it to the root in an even front. A cow tears. It seizes a large clump of vegetation indiscriminately, coarse grass, thistle, young shoot, and pulls. Where the sheep created monoculture, the cow creates a gap. Into the gap moves something else: wildflowers, legumes, rare grasses that previously had no room. January 2024. 11 Exmoor ponies, the breed genetically closest to the prehistoric wild horse of the British Isles, were present. Their role differs from the pigs and cattle. Ponies eat coarse vegetation, reeds, thistles, old grasses that others pass over. Where there was an even mat of tough grass, a mosaic of varying height appears. Over the first year of monitoring, entomologists recorded a substantial increase in pollinating insect diversity on plots where the ponies graze compared to control plots on neighboring farms with comparable terrain. The data are being verified through university monitoring. And the ROE deer. They were not invited. They simply lived here before all the others. At low density, roe deer are beneficial. They create small local disturbances, sculpt the understory, tread paths that thrushes and wrens then follow. But the same animal can eat a young oak before it rises above knee height. This is not a contradiction. It is a balance that depends on density. At Banff, the roe deer have not yet crossed a critical threshold, but nobody guarantees they will not. 5 species. None knowing the others existed, none with a plan. But the most interesting thing happened not with the trees and not with the insects. Paul Ramsey released the animals to restore vegetation, to bring the trees back, to make the land more diverse. He was not thinking about water. The first hydrological data came not from the project itself, but from researchers monitoring the flood dynamics of small rivers in the Tay catchment. In 2 episodes of heavy rainfall in autumn 2023, they recorded an anomaly. Water downstream of Banff rose more slowly and fell more slowly than at neighboring sites in the same catchment. The cause turned out to be unexpected. Where pigs had rooted, the porosity of the topsoil had increased. Where ponies graze unevenly and leave patches of long vegetation, water is held in the grass and runs more slowly into the channel. Where the farm removed internal fencing and allowed animals to move across the slopes without restriction, small natural trampled paths appeared spontaneously, replacing old drainage ditches and distributing water horizontally across the hillside rather than vertically downward. But if you look at the whole system together, it becomes clear that the surprise was only for the humans. 50 beaver dams higher in the catchment had already been slowing water for years. A study published in the journal Hydrological Processes in 2021 showed that sequences of beaver dams can reduce peak flood discharge by 14% without any engineering intervention. Removing one such sequence in a documented case led to an 81% increase in flow velocity. The beavers at Banff were not solving a flood problem, they were simply building lodges. But the effect had been accumulating for 20 years. The pigs added their contribution from above. Broken ground absorbs water better. The ponies added theirs. Long uneven grass slows runoff on the slope. 3 species, 3 mechanisms, no shared plan. Nobody designed a flood retention system. It emerged on its own as a side effect of animal behavior. This matters for one reason that has nothing to do with the aesthetics of wild nature. Floods cost money. Perth and Kinross Council spends millions of pounds on flood defense in the lower reaches of the Tay catchment. That expenditure is documented in public SEPA reports. If natural water retention at the catchment level, not through dams but through changes in soil structure, can reduce peak runoff by even 10%, this is not ecology, it is infrastructure. Ramsey was not selling this argument when he launched the project. He had not anticipated it. But it is precisely this argument that now comes up in conversations with municipal officials who would not otherwise sit at the same table as rewilding projects. Here is what happened unplanned. The plan was about something else entirely, and the most consequential result turned out to be not biological, but hydrological and economic. And this is exactly where the critics, the farmers, the ornithologists, the skeptics were partly right. Some erosion patches did appear where pigs concentrated near water sources. One ground-nesting bird species reduced its presence on one field compared to the previous year. This is not a catastrophe, but it is not an unqualified victory either. Paul Ramsey does not claim to have found a model that works for everyone. He keeps records. He shows the data to those who ask. He sometimes looks surprised, and that is perhaps the most honest part of the whole project.